Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer SS&C Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, or best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to see how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Marchuk. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. Today, we'll be talking with Chris Marshall, a man who wears many hats. He's the head of global investment strategy for Dragon Investment Managers, a speaker, a futurist, and the author of the book, Decoding Change, Understanding What the Heck is Going On and Why We Should Be Far More Optimistic About Our Future. I love that title, by the way. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, Chris.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me on, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Excellent. Well, I want to know what a futurist is. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and how a global investment manager came to write a book on change.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess my background, I fell into finance. That's probably the easiest way to describe that. So before that, I was actually a youth athlete. I skied on the British junior ski team. And by default, I got to an age where I basically hadn't made the senior squad and I had to settle down and do something. And I'd always been good with maths. And so kind of finance was the next step. But what the relevance of that is that as a junior athlete, psychology is really important. And this is going to come into our conversation because I don't believe you can look to the future without understanding how change changes us as individuals and how change affects our decision making. So the progression, so it was 2007 when I got into the world of finance, and little did I know it was this period of extreme euphoria. I was with a global bank, which was a very interesting time to be with a global bank. And my career path, which, well, I thought anyway, was this kind of accelerated path to become an investment manager. That's what I was told. That's what the bank told me. And then all of a sudden, we all know the history. 2008 happened and everything fell through the floor. And it was really that moment where I realized that the economic models that so many people are using, not just the bank I was with, not just other investment managers, but governments around the world. So like there's this piece that the European Commission put out in 2008, just saying, oh yeah, we see what's going on in the US, but don't worry, we've got a really strong domestic economy and we're going to be fine. We might see a slight moderation of GDP. And it was all this stuff going on that was kind of like, oh my word, the models they're using, they look really pretty, but they don't bear much resemblance to real life. And so I started looking for, okay, well, if those don't work, how can we actually look to the future? And this is where I started to come across other things. So actually, I went back to uni at this point. I did a master's in behavioral science, because that was one of the things that economics had taken out was us as humans. They decided, oh, it's a bit too complex to model, so we'll just take out the human element. It's, enough said on that, really. But then kind of futures is the other side. So futurists, professional futurists, it's not actually about predicting the future, which a lot of people think it is. It sounds a very sci-fi term, doesn't it, being a futurist? It's really kind of looking at scenarios and working out those multiple paths ahead of us and what might happen and how do you prepare for those things. So this is why it's really useful for business owners and entrepreneurs and investment managers. So typically, where I sit now within the investment community, I'm what you call a kind of a macro economist. I'm a global macro investment strategist. And normally kind of most of my work there goes up until about the 18-month time horizon. That's kind of where the sweet spot is for that work. Whereas futures work starts going way beyond that. So you start really looking at the biggest trends and mega trends around. And that's then how we link it back into the book. Because what I was finding more and more was when we start looking at the future, we're not very good at talking about this in kind of the general population. People aren't taught to think about the future other than they hear something on the news and they go, oh, I know how it all plays out now. Which is perhaps the worst way to think about the future. And so this is kind of how all these different things came together. And now I find myself, so I kind of inherited the nickname, the uncertainty scientist, which blends together both my fascination for how uncertainty is around us, i.e. the way I always describe it is disruption and radical change, whether that's coming from innovation or demographic change or global order change, is the other side of the same coin as uncertainty. increasing disruption equals increasing uncertainty. And when we then bring that back to the other side of my life as a behavioral scientist and coach, it's the fascination of how does uncertainty affect our decision-making and actually even affect our well-being, which we don't often think about until it's too late, until we're stressed out of our brains and overwhelmed and burnt out.
I can see how they all fit together based on what we described it. And certainly the interesting mix of finance and behavioral studies, I think, does provide you some kind of guidance from this futurist kind of viewpoint to understand how things sort of fit together and model that out in a way that could lead to some, or show how it leads to something else. So as you know, and everybody knows, this whole change thing has been very rapid, especially in the technology sector. We've certainly seen that most recently with the whole ChatGPT thing. It's sort of explode out of nowhere, right? And there's all sorts of change that's going along associated with the ChatGPT stuff. But this whole pace of change, it seems like it's picking up, but you seem to say there's a cycle to all this. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the pace of change, I mean, let's just tackle that first. I believe, as you've just described, that the pace of change is picking up. But that's not to say that it's not part of a cycle. So, normally the way I describe this is that there's always change around us, but it's not always at a constant pace. So it's consistent, but not constant. And what kind of affects that is how far through the kind of the innovation cycle we are. So what's really fascinating, and, again, one of the things I try and talking about trying to educate people about how change happens. So I try and outline a few different frameworks in the book, which I hope are pretty easy to understand. And one of them is just this innovation cycle. And so we're really talking about kind of the changes to infrastructure, because that's where technology really sits, is it changes the infrastructure, which then in turn changes how businesses operate and manufacture and produce and what products we end up with. But yeah, on the point of cycles, so where disruptive technology kind of fits in is since the Industrial Revolution, we've had a pretty consistent cycle of about 50 to 60 years. We have these paradigm shifting innovations. I should probably kind of spell out that it's not a single innovation. They're normally clusters. So if we go back to the Industrial Revolution, most people would cite, it's an easy shorthand to say, the Industrial Revolution was all about James Watt's steam engine. And that's true, but James Watt's steam engine would have been useless without the water frame and the spinning jenny. So, two other technologies which allowed for the production of textiles in a new way. And so when we kind of go forward, we can label these out to map things out for the audience. Is about 50 years later, we get the steam engine, so George Stephenson's locomotive. About 50 to 60 years after that, we start looking at steel and heavy engineering. Then we come into oil and, those sort of products, and basically mass production techniques really take off in a different way. And then the most recent one is a semiconductor. It's a 1970s invention. We don't think of it like that because most people have only started using that word in the last 24, 36 months. But it's a 50-year-old piece of technology. And I mean, what's fascinating about these is they are true paradigms. Again, a paradigm is a complete upending of our understanding. In our modern world, we use that word for everything. It's like a paradigm of diet, or it's a paradigm of this, and it's just somebody's just launched a new website. But when we're talking about innovation, truly disruptive innovation, they are paradigm shifts, and they basically they uncover a new way of thinking and doing, and that's why they're so disruptive, because the old model is suddenly seen for what it is, a lesser model, but it's normally a cluster. And so that's the interesting thing to think about this time around, is that, again, the semiconductor by itself, if you look at the very early kind of papers on the semiconductor in the 70s, they thought they were just going to sell a handful of these things. But it was a really cool invention, but there's maybe 5 or 6 companies that's going to put this to use. And until you then attach all these other inventions on top, it doesn't take on its life. And that's what we're starting to see with AI. Again, AI is not new. In the book, one of the stories I kind of lay out is my own childhood with a little thing called the Tamagotchi. And we don't think of that as AI, but it was a step towards it. It was more lifeful than simply just a computer. It responded to you. And so this is kind of where cycles are useful, because they allow us to see the long tails of innovation. And that's super important, because when we're, again, let's bring this back to psychology, when we're blindsided by change, that's when it's truly stressful, anxious, fear resulting. And, our thinking gets completely skewed and biased when we don't see something coming, and it takes us like kind of out the game.
Well, I'd like to continue on that, because you're in your book, and you did it just now. You tend to go back, and that's just a little bit. You go back pretty far in history to kind of set a context to look at a future innovation or a current innovation that's happening. What is it about this historical context that helps us process change as people?
So I think it's really about awareness. That's what it is for me. It allows you to have an awareness which you don't get if you only look at the current cycle. Like if you just take AI in isolation and just go, oh my word, this is going to change the world, and I have no precedent for what that looks like when massive paradigm shifting innovation comes along, then you can't help but be kind of like, oh my word, what does this mean? I'm now fearful for humanity and everything else. And so I actually think the most useful thing of looking back is not only you get a feel for how change is consistent, that it's always going on. And it allows you to kind of go, so I talk a lot about liminal thinking. So liminal thinking is this idea that we're always in a transition phase. It's just it's a lovely human illusion that we like to think that the status quo is real, that there is nothing permanent. Nature tells us that. You and me aren't permanent, but we're either in a growth phase or a declining phase. And we can even take that all the way back to our basically our brain chemistry. Even in a minute by minute state, we're either repairing or growing or atrophying. And so for me, looking back, it's about understanding how change occurs and actually understanding how we react to it. So again, let's go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. As you say, we're not looking at 10 years, 20 years, we're looking at hundreds of years. And the thing you learn from that is that you had this uprising of a band-like group called the Luddites. They were extraordinarily fearful for their livelihood. So for listeners who perhaps haven't come across the Luddites, they were the crafters. They were the people who were making all these products before the machines came along. And they would have been very skilled. They probably would have been pretty highly paid. They were making essential tools and garments. And then along came the machine, and it essentially threatened their way of life. And so they took to the streets, and they decided that they would try and burn as many of the factories, that they would loot, kind of as much as they could. They would destroy as much of this thing which was threatening them. And when you start looking at, the parallels to other innovations, and even it's kind of, you get that feeling today. So what we're talking about is you kind of go, okay, well, when real significant change comes along, we need to understand our behavior, because that's actually the thing which either allows us to progress or holds us back on an individual basis and a society. And I think the comforting thing of looking back is that, yes, in the kind of the short term, the Luddites were right to be fearful. But you and me are sat here, and humanity has progressed in incredible ways, unbelievable ways. To them, ways they simply could not have imagined, and for the better. And the way that it works is that, yes, current careers and jobs can disappear. But guess what? The technology brings with it completely new areas of the economy and society that you and me have no idea about. We can take a stab at a few, but we're going to get surprised. And I think that's lovely. And that's kind of why we need to embrace uncertainty, and why we need to look back to look forward.
That makes a lot of sense. So I tend to focus a lot on digital transformations that I see in organizations, both commercial and government. They're able to service their customers more effectively, their citizens more effectively. But digital transformation can be boiled down to technologies that are sort of stacked on top of each other. You mentioned it before, this kind of concept of innovations being stacked, that they use this to create specific outcomes. So each layer is supporting the one above it, and you tend to see these broader systemic changes with the lens of multiple layers of things that are evolving, creating change that we need to address. I know we can talk about some geopolitical stuff in a little bit here, but you think about geopolitical changes or climate change spurring innovation in one area that sparks innovation in a completely separate field, you know, bringing it back to something more practical or tangible, how can an executive running an organization of any kind, both government and commercial, make sense of all of these multiple layers and their interplays to be able to kind of plan for what's next?
So, yeah, I mean, that's a big question.
Sorry. Things that go through my mind, I being a futurist with your viewpoint, I'm hoping that you have some contextual framework for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where I typically talk about the layers of the world. And I think it allows people to suddenly so a lot of my work, if I sum it up, not to numb it down too much, but all I try and do is I try and get people to stand back. Because when we're in the midst of everything whirling around us, there's no way you see things clearly. And so one of the tools I do that, certainly when we're talking about how the world's changing, and this leads into why I think we're at this radical point of change, this real pivotal moment of change. I'm going to go as far as to say that we're on the cusp of change, which is probably more aligned with the magnitude we saw when we stopped being hunter-gatherers and became a settled agrarian society than the change we saw in the Industrial Revolution. That's how big I think it is. And I'll explain it through these layers. And this is kind of one of the tools I think individuals, businesses, organizations, investment managers, everybody can kind of get their head around and use. And the first thing you start to realize, this model kind of I adapted from it was an architectural model looking at the built environment around them. And what you find is there's lots of layers around the world, or kind of layers in society, in the world around us, I should say. And they update at different speeds. And there's another relationship that it's not just speed, it's magnitude of change. Faster updating layers have less magnitude or less impact. And the ones which are really slow, so what we typically call megatrends, have massive impact. And so if we kind of label those layers, it's going to start making a lot more sense to people. So the top layer is product. Everybody is used to this. You know, whether you work in a fast-moving consumer goods industry or whether you just shop, product updates at a ridiculous pace today. Used to be kind of annually, maybe every few years. Now it's seasonally, monthly, weekly. Your digital product can update daily. And the products which capture the needs of society the best are the ones which thrive. The businesses are now the second layer. So below product, you get business. Business updates slower than product. That makes intuitive sense. You know, it's why a company like Apple, who continuously rolls out products which people like, grows to be a huge business. If they only got one product right, they would have been a big business, but then not really scaled from there. So they continually get the product layer right. So businesses update slower than product. And then we get into what you're talking about with AI and things. Then we get into the infrastructure layer. And this updates, as we said, every kind of 50 to 60 years. It updates slower than businesses and way slower than product. But it's when that moves, businesses now suddenly, they either move to the new paradigm or they start fading or even disappear. So we could insert here examples of Blockbuster, Kodak, you know, there are countless ones. BlackBerry, who kind of laughed at Apple, you know, as we've mentioned Apple, going, who wants a phone with no buttons? Nobody. But that's not the bottom layer. There's 6 layers. So we've not even got halfway through when we get to these paradigm shifting technologies. And it's when we start seeing changes originate in these bottom 3 layers that you know that you're in a period of time which is not just disruptive change, but radical change. The next layer down is essentially regulation. So there's government regulation. Now, normally you actually see government regulation, or at least what we've been used to, is that changes happen at the product level. Businesses slowly change with that. The paradigm shifts come along every 50 to 60 years. And then we see regulation kind of like respond to that. So Bitcoin's a great or crypto assets in general are a great example of this at the moment, where regulators are suddenly going, oh my word, this new thing's around. By the way, it's not new for most people. They know it's been around for 15 years or so. But regulators are going, oh my word, we've got this new thing and our regulation doesn't capture it. We now need to respond to the changes in the upper layers. What we're seeing today, though, is we're now seeing regulation be enacted, which is not responding to the top layers, but trying to drive the top layers. So this is where we're getting influences from the bottom up. This is very different. Below regulation, we then get cultural philosophy. And when you start seeing cultural philosophy move, my word, these are the biggest points of change. I'm going to kind of caveat that as one bigger one because we've got another layer to go. But cultural philosophy is a huge change. And it tends to happen, interestingly, actually, while we're talking about digital transformation, is cultural philosophy changes when we look back through long history, we find these radical points of cultural change when we either have a world order change, so i.e. who's the hyperpower of the world, which is quite an obvious move, but we also get them with what I call information revolutions. So where we basically broaden out or democratize information, that it's no longer the kind of just among a few people, it's now among a massive group of people, and you start to bring in new values and perspectives and opinions, and all of a sudden there's this realization, oh my word, we've seen things the wrong way around, or we've seen it just from a very narrow perspective. And we could throw in here today so many things which are major news topics, which I believe are part of that broadening or the spreading out of information, that we're suddenly turning around and going, oh my word, I can't believe we did that 10 years ago, 20 years ago. That I can't believe we discriminated against this group of people or whatever it is. So cultural philosophy is massive. That's on the move. I believe that the 07-08 great financial crisis was a turning point, and maybe we can go into that in a minute. But then this bottom layer is the natural environment. It's the slowest moving by a long way. For centuries, you can believe it's not even moving. You know, the kind of this falsehood of permanence. But again, you know, the natural environment is always on the move. And we're now at a point where not only we're able to measure it and observe it, but we're also at a point where it's threatening to disrupt the normal way of life. And so that's kind of a model I talk about a lot, because I think it allows people to stand back and go, okay, well, where does this change fit in? Where's it originating? And also to understand that just because at a regulation level, you want to suddenly change something else, those layers have their own speed of updating. You can't just simply command that a slower layer updates the same pace as a product layer. It doesn't work. You know, they have their own pace. And if you try and force it, you can completely disrupt things, that everything has its own speed. And yes, we can encourage change, but not force it.
So I wanted to ask specifically on those things. So you mentioned the regulations trying to drive upper layers. We're also seeing how sort of those upper layers are driving even the lowest layers. Let's talk about climate change, for example. Products and the way that we use or operate or manage them, et cetera, are having an effect that goes all the way down to the lowest level of this change, which is then accelerating the change from the bottom up. Do you see that type of shift in how the order of things, I guess, traditionally are, where the lower layers move slowly and then affects the upper layers on a basis, having that turned upside down? Do you see that as something that we're going to adapt more readily to, or you think that that's the part where it becomes a radical change because we are now affecting things that generally move slowly, but now are moving much more quickly?
Yeah, or at least we've become aware of them. I think the change in the natural environment is very similar to how most people go through a paradigm shift in innovation, is they ignore it until the last possible point and then go, oh, this is quite important. And all of a sudden the world's moved. So I don't think we're kind of necessarily speeding it up, not, you know, to kind of be careful what I say here, but, you know, kind of over the last few hundred years, we definitely have had an impact on the climate, but I'm essentially it's well, I just hit my microphone. Sorry. Essentially it's a case of we're now becoming aware of what it is. And I think that what's making it feel far faster is that we're catching up mentally with what's going on. It's a sudden kind of like the curtain being pulled back and you're like, oh, okay, I wasn't even aware of this. So yeah, I do think it's a point of radical change. And I don't think you can stop that, you know, kind of, if we want to actually undo some of the things that we've done over the last few hundred years, it can't be anything other than radical change. And therefore you actually turn your attention to kind of how does that affect you? How does uncertainty affect you? And how does that affect an organization? And this is kind of where I'm an optimist with a massive caveat. My optimism comes from, again, when you look back through history, there is one thing which stands out, and that is humans have this incredible ability of being creative, innovative, and adaptable. I mean, it's astonishing. It really is. And we see it wherever you look. But we actually stop being those things when we become stressed and overwhelmed and burnt out. And that's really the kind of the big thing here, is that we really do have some hurdles up ahead. I mean, let's be honest about things. We do have some massive disruption. We have some real hurdles. I'm not an optimist from a point of view. I'll just close my eyes and think positive thoughts and the world's great. We have hurdles to overcome. We have challenges to meet. I just believe that we can do it if we're in the right place, if we're in the right state, I should say. If we're not in the right state, those hurdles, I think we still do overcome, but we just make it a far more painful process for ourselves. And that's really where it becomes fascinating. And this is something that, I think businesses and organizations are not paying enough attention to in the slightest. They're not paying enough attention to the thought process or decision making. And this is where you see people checking out of the economy, just going, I've had enough. This is just way too much. I just want a simple life. And that's fine. But we've actually got to pull together to get through this. And just checking out, I'm going to call it, kind of a lovely thought, but it limits the potential of us as a human race. If you just kind of go, no, I'm not going to contribute to the future of this.
So you bring up some really good points. Where does this responsibility lie? So if you start talking about we all need to ... There's a expectation that there's some way for we all to get into that same state of mind, or to be brought around to the realization of these changes, to be able to accept them or address the change in a way that makes it a positive thing versus a negative thing. How do we as a society, because we're not talking anymore about a company or organization or a family or any specific country. We're talking about a species, us as humans, and the place that we're in now. How do we, the collective we, address this?
So I'm going to say I think it is the organization level. I'm going to come back to that, and I'll explain why. So I do quite a lot of speaking, public speaking. And obviously at some point in that career, I had to choose, well, who's my audience? My topics cover so many different groups that it could have been any. I mean, it could have been youth, it could have been government. But actually where I felt like I probably have the most impact was the corporate and organizational level. Because I felt that if I could speak to that audience and also kind of coach people at the top of those organizations, then that really does have this massive impact. And I'll kind of explain why. So again, when you go back through history, when you start seeing regulation for the sake of regulation, and maybe I'll explain this a little bit better through kind of how innovation comes about. But when you start seeing regulation for the sake of regulation, you start to see economies rot from the inside out. So we could cite any centrally planned economy. And that's not because I believe governments are inherently bad or anything else, but it's the concentration of power. It's the opposite of what we talked about when we said the democratization of information. What you're doing is you're saying, okay, well, I don't want an opinion. I want to hand over that decision to a select few or even one person. And I believe they're all knowing and everything else. Now, that's pretty dangerous, because if you actually look and understand innovation, and again, I don't think many people do, is the innovation we see around us, there were chances, okay? And I take my hat off to entrepreneurs. I love them to bits because they're the most courageous, ridiculous people. They kind of go, oh, there's this problem in society and I reckon I can solve it. And I'm going to put all my wealth and all my time and energy, put everything on the line to try and do it. And yes, you could take a very cynical approach, go, oh, they're doing it for the money. Who cares? Like if they progress humanity, I mean, I don't think that even comes into it. I mean, the other bit that is missed here is profit is a brilliant marker of progress. And it's actually the bit that governments miss. Now, if you don't have a profit line, if you don't have a bottom line, how do you know what you're doing is effective? You don't. You just keep doing it in hope. Corporations actually have this profit mechanism, and that allows them to go, okay, well, that project's working, this one isn't. And so when we come to how we enact this, I think once corporations and their leaders start realizing just how much more efficient us humans are when we're collaborative, cooperative, when we are empathetic to each other, when we're creative, when we're adaptable, and we actually really start putting those things in place. We've seen lip service to this. I'm going to throw Google under the bus a little bit here. Kind of like having a canteen with crab cakes every morning. Yeah, it's a lovely little throwaway thing, but it's not really employee wellness. In fact, they get bored of it. I've heard stories of employees going, "Oh, not crab cakes again." And so organizations for me is the place, because in an increasingly uncertain world, I think one of my greatest fears is you actually start seeing workplace stress and burnout increase massively. And it's not necessarily because of the work, it's because of the environment. The more stressed we get, one of the really interesting things we start seeing is our behavior changes. We go from being empathetic and understanding other people's perspectives to being disengaged and rigid. And it's a massive contributor to workplace toxicity. And if we really want to embrace, I'm neurodivergent, and, kind of, for me, I've loved the post-COVID era because I get to work at home without distraction. But for me to go back into an open plan office, what I'm trying to say is if you want to run your staff to their optimal, an optimal being a personalized thing, not just a broad brush thing, then you need to be able to shift perspectives and see things from not just your perspective, but theirs. And that only happens at lower stress states. And this is where organizations have this amazing power, because they are the ones that basically, well, we can be in them for, I was going to say 7 hours a day, but most people are in them way longer than that.
Especially if you're American, you're there for more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you have very few holidays. Everybody loves holidays. And I guess this is kind of one of the things which the penny drops. So one of the questions I quite often ask an audience is, where do you have your best thinking? And I play a bit of a game with them. And I just say, put your hand up when I say the location. And I always start with the office because it's hilarious, because nobody puts their hand up. I've had like 2 or 3 people, and I've realized that they're sat next to their boss and they feel like they should put their hand up. But it's only when you start going like in the shower gets like 98% of people. Everyone's like, yes, I have my best thinking in the shower. And you say walking, running, yoga. And then it's really the point of that is it's got nothing to do with the actual environment you're in. It's the state you're in internally. And this is what businesses and corporations are missing. I think that, the last kind of cultural philosophy shift was the Industrial Revolution, really. I know I've said we're starting a new one, but the one previous to that was the Industrial Revolution. And we always think of that as the mechanization of production. But I'd encourage people to think of it as the mechanization of thought as well, that we just wanted everything to follow a flowchart and to be a tick list and KPIs and everything else. We humans don't work. We're not robots. We're not machines. That's why I don't think AI replaces us, because we have this incapability of just going down paths that aren't even there until we tread on them. And we're now in this era where I think we start really realizing this. And hopefully workplaces are the place which allow us to navigate this period of unprecedented change.
Well, I'd like to bring up something that you brought. It sparked my interest, because these are conversations that I've been having, not only with other guests, but also internally to our organization and with other customers that we're working with, related to the generational changes that are going on. You mentioned where you do your best thinking and whatnot, and how folks like some of the boomers or me as a Gen Xer, we've grew up with those tick boxes, those lists, the KPIs, and as we're now in our older age, we're generally in management, or we're running these organizations, versus perhaps the millennial and Gen Zs, who, as we saw with sort of the quiet quitting thing, were very quick to say like, I don't want this. Yeah, I'll contribute, but not like that. So we're seeing this definite shift in terms of how younger generations, and I can say younger generations because I'm an older generation, sees work and sees productivity specifically, and what is productive and how you become productive. When you look at organizations who are perhaps run by a boomer or Gen Xer, how can you convey those types of thoughts or those types of concepts. You mentioned this game you put out, and you said people do better thinking in the shower. But now we're seeing this mandate for return to work, which is, and the tip of this is what you just said. We're not going to necessarily get more work out of there, but we may have more collaboration. So there's probably some kind of interplay in there that is better when we're together, but maybe not in the way that we used to be together. So can you give us an idea of what that might look like as we go forward?
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things you're seeing, and you mentioned like the return to work programs going on at the moment, or kind of even mandates in some companies where they're just saying no, like we're cutting the work from home. If it's as extreme as the media is reporting, I think it's sad that, it's again, what we're moving away from is a broad brush approach. So, you've probably heard this phrase countless times in terms of product, but it is the age of personalization and of individualization. But it's not just about product, it's about thinking. And, to have such a broad brush approach, to me does sound a bit backwards. But when you dig into the details of most of these companies, actually what you find is it's actually a hybrid model. They're not actually saying, okay, yeah, we're going back to Monday to Friday, 9 till 5 or whatever, 7 till 8. They're actually saying, kind of, we want you in. And I get that because we are social creatures. There's another study just been done, and a lot of people who loved the kind of work from home gig actually did really good work, but they're now actually starting to really kind of struggle with loneliness. And so we are social creatures, and it's about experimenting. That's really what life is as a human. It's about being curious and experimenting. And just as we see with innovation, these people kind of go, okay, well, I'm going to try this. Guess what? There's a reason why 95% of businesses fail. The early startups is because their idea didn't actually solve the problem. And the business which gets this model and has their employees work without burnout and stress and overload and deliver their best work and share their experience and expertise with their colleagues and, gets all these things that they need as well as what the business needs, is the one that suddenly people go, what on earth are they doing? And then everybody rallies around. That was the case, you could take any of the paradigm shifts. Quite often it's a point where people go, no, that won't work. I didn't know. That's not how we've done it. We've never done it that way. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, these people are like kind of doing crazy stuff. They're coming up with incredible ideas. They're being creative. They haven't got the staff turnover. They haven't got burnout. And so we're in this experimentation phase. And to be honest, it's kind of, again, I think as a manager or a CEO, you've got to be aware and curious. You've got to be open-minded enough to go, no, it's not just my perspective here. I need to, things are moving, and therefore I've got to just kind of be aware of what's going on. And that's true of innovation as well as management style.
Gotcha. Our last question for you is related to what you just brought up, and that is, you mentioned creativity, and earlier on you mentioned this concept that we're social, and we talk about people together, getting together. Creativity is social. We think about a dinner party. We're all interacting together, and we're all enjoying that kind of interaction type of thing. When we go to work, we're obviously in a different kind of interaction. It has a specific purpose behind it to be able to do something, but also, I know everywhere is schooling that has taught us to be more rigid as we go forward. As you see these transitions to these different models with these different kinds of experiments, would you expect us to see, bringing it all back together here, AI and these digital workers as co-workers helping us to become more creative by shifting the type of work that we do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if AI actually lives up to what people are saying right now, at the moment, we've got a glorified chatbot, sorry to the incredible engineers behind these things, but at the moment we're playing with, can it do this? Can it do that? And, over time, we're going to find exactly what it really is good at and what it's not so good at. But in that kind of assumption that it does do all these things that we're talking about, yeah, my view is that, again, Hollywood does a very good job of selling us this dystopian view, which makes them billions of dollars every film, that the robots and, powered by AI and machine learning, they basically keep us as pets. I don't believe that narrative. We've always had tools. This is, it's like in the 80s, I think there were maths teachers who were took to the streets just going, calculators are going to corrupt children's minds. Today, we'd be like, well, they didn't really. And so I believe the model is that, it's not AI that takes you out. It's the human with AI that takes you out. And, and that's much more about, in that there's a far more optimistic view of that you have the chance to kind of do that too. It's if you want to be rigid and go, no, I've always done it this way, I'm going to carry on doing it this way. Well, fine, maybe that will work, maybe it won't. But whenever you come to this period of uncertainty, it's always about flexibility, mental flexibility, more so than anything else. And this is kind of where, I'll share one last tool with your listeners. And that's kind of, so as the uncertainty scientist, kind of bringing together these things as kind of a professional futurist and behavioral scientist that developed a framework of thinking. And that's what I just call the pause, move framework. And when the environment around you becomes completely chaotic, when it becomes really, really disruptive, there is a paradox of pausing. And the pause that you implement allows you to move faster. We're taught the opposite. We're taught that pausing is laziness and you should just get your head down and work harder. It doesn't work in a fast-paced environment. And the two pauses are, the first pause, you've got to check what state you're in. So coming back to that idea of where's your best thinking. If you're finding yourself in a stressed out, anxious state, you're not actually even thinking clearly. So pause 1 is all about building that self-mastery. Pause 2 is only available to you once you've actually mastered your own state and you're coming at this problem from a low stress state. And that is, you start to look around and seek other perspectives to yours. And that process, it can be done in a matter of seconds, but it saves you from the many, many biases and rigid thinking and closed thinking, which would just essentially lead you down the path of being taken out by something which you refuse to accept or refuse to believe. And that's really the skill of the future. I think it's not necessarily a physical skill that I can do this, because AI, I believe, will assist us with many of those things that we talk about as physical skills or technical skills. It'll be about how well we can tolerate uncertainty. And the brilliant news is, that we can train ourselves to do that. We can train ourselves to become super tolerant of uncertainty and navigate massive chaos. And I think that's the most rewarding part of my job, is working with individuals, whether they're CEOs or investment managers or entrepreneurs, and, coaching them and guiding them through that process. And they're preparing themselves for that future outcome.
That's fantastic. And that's where I see the optimist in you come out for sure. So thank you for joining us today. Fantastic conversation. I'm going to leave a link to your book, which is called Decoding Change, Understanding What the Heck is Going On and Why We Should Be Far More Optimistic About Our Future. Chris, again, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel where you'll find all of our previous episodes. And to make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you've heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how SS&C Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise